All right, it's 7:32. I think we'll start. Good evening, good afternoon for those who are on the West Coast, and good morning for those of you who are in Asia. Welcome to InnoVision 2024. My name is Andy Shi, and I'm the Executive Director of CPAC. I want to start by acknowledging that CPAC is situated in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples. This city is also known by its Anglicized Mohawk name, Toronto. For those of you who don't know CPAC yet, we are a multidimensional organization. We are a professional association with over 30,000 members, a career and skills development service provider, and also a research training and education organization that advocates on issues important to Chinese and Asian Canadians. This last part is done through the CPAC Institute. When this event is over, I invite you to Google search underrepresentation of Chinese Canadian leadership. Underrepresentation of Chinese Canadian leadership. You will find the CPAC Institute's research report, which shows that in the Greater Toronto Area, Chinese Canadians represent 11% of the population, but only 2% of senior leadership across all sectors. So one of our objectives, apart from doing training services, is to develop leadership and increase our representation in the senior ranks. In the months to come, CPAC will start developing leadership training programs, and I hope you will support such initiatives. In the meantime, we have partnered with Trinity Western University on a graduate degree program, Master of Arts in Leadership and Doctor of Business Administration. Trinity Western University is a private university. Because it's private, you may not have heard of it, but its quality of education is ranked A+ by the Globe and Mail for 7 consecutive years. Its leadership program is regarded as the best among over 30 similar programs. Its tuition fees are much lower than those public universities. The beauty of these programs is that you can get a degree by studying online in either Chinese or English. The program in Chinese is much better than its counterpart in English because the professors of the online program, the online Chinese program, are not local. They are selected from around the world who have both doctorate degrees and actual leadership experience. If you want to know more about our degree programs in leadership, please go to the CPAC website, and CPAC members will get a $1,000 scholarship to pursue this degree. So that's a little bit background about CPAC. Now, to kick off this evening's event, I'd like to invite our President, T. Wang, to make a few welcome remarks. T.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and CPAC friends. Well, welcome to CPAC's InnoVision 2024 Summit today. We gather online to explore the groundbreaking advancements in 2 critical areas: the cancer diagnosis and the treatment, and the human-computer interaction. Well, our first session will be directed by the keynote speaker, Dr. Alex Mariakakis, a brilliant mind at the intersection of a computer science and medicine. And after that, we will have Dr. Aaron Schimmer, Dr. Gang Zhang, and Dr. Benjamin Locke. They will discuss the cutting-edge tools, breakthrough discoveries, and products that promise hope for the patients worldwide. So as we embark on this knowledge-sharing journey, let us remember that each breakthrough, each collaboration brings us closer to a healthier more compassionate world. So engage, learn, and being inspired. Thank you for joining us at the InnoVision 2024. Let's make history together. Thank you.
Thank you, T. Now, the first session of the 2024 InnoVision Summit is devoted to human-computer interaction. That's the fascinating area to tell us all about it is an expert in this field, Dr. Alex Mariakakis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, and also an affiliate scientist at TECNA, which is part of the University Health Network that provides healthcare solutions. Dr. Mariakakis runs the Computational Health and Interaction Lab at the U of T. He and his research group delivers innovative solutions using expertise in multiple sub-areas of computer science, particularly machine learning, signal processing, computer vision, and human-computer interaction. His work has garnered multiple awards and a lot of attention from the media. And tonight, most importantly, I'm happy to announce for him he's getting married next month. I can't wait to hear his presentation. So at the end of the presentation, you will have some time to ask questions. For now, I'll turn the screen to Dr. Mariakakis.
Thank you very much. Let me make sure that I can share my screen properly. Okay, I believe everyone should be able to see my screen now. Let me make one more adjustment. Awesome. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate everyone's ability to join virtually. And I'm really incredibly honored to be your keynote speaker for this session, to be able to talk to you about human-computer interaction in general, as well as my specific area of research that I work in, specifically in digital health technologies. So to start off, I'm going to start off with a very broad definition of what we mean when we're saying human-computer interaction. And in a broad stroke, human-computer interaction, or what I'll call HCI for short, is a multidisciplinary field that focuses on the design, evaluation, and implementation of interactive computing systems for human applications. Very often when we think of computer science, we think about computers that are like the desktops and the laptops in front of us, and maybe you're thinking of GPUs and servers and all these other technologies as well. But in the end, there are humans who have to use these technologies. And of course, we're the ones who have to interact with the technologies in order to get some benefit out of them. So there's actually a lot of different kinds of research that can happen in human-computer interaction. To give you a couple of examples of different sub-areas of HCI, one of them involves interactive technologies. So one of the ways I like to describe, this area of interactive technologies is by thinking about what are new ways for people to interact with digital interfaces or computers in general. So as like an old example, you can think about the keyboards and the mice in front of you, because originally when we had computers, we had to type in terminals, and that gave us very limited affordances. But now we have all sorts of different ways that we can interact with computers. For example, there are ways that we can use gestures using cameras to be able to control the interfaces in front of us. I'm sure some of you have worked with virtual reality systems before, where you can move controllers around to be able to interact with a virtual world, and that's yet another form of human-computer interaction. And on the cutting edge of technologies, we also have brain-computer interfaces. So rather than having to move our hands, we could just sense and analyze the brain signals that are coming out of our brains to be able to understand someone's intentions. And all these technologies here at their core rely on this idea of analyzing sensor data, whether it's from motion, from cameras, or from these brain interfaces, to be able to understand some sort of signal that indicates what someone's trying to do. But there are other forms of human-computer interaction. So for example, there are people who do work at data visualization, where the question they're trying to answer, what are the new ways that people can try to understand data or help people understand data? So for example, you might have seen these kinds of graphics in news articles or maybe on a news network or online social media, for example. And on the one hand, you can think about this as a visual design, more of an artistic piece, but there's also this computer science piece of thinking about how do you present this numerical data essentially in a way that will clearly convey a message to different audiences, whether it's lawmakers, to decision makers in politics, or even just the average ordinary person. And one third area of human-computer interaction I'll talk about is social computing. Because as we think about the different kinds of technologies that we encounter as humans with computers, we can think about social media, social networks, and both the benefits and the downsides of these technologies. We can think about what kinds of communities are we forming with these technologies, and we can also think about what are the kinds of information that are going back and forth from these communities, and is there right information, wrong information, what kinds of information is moving through these networks, and all sorts of interesting questions there. So hopefully that gives a bit of a flavor of human computer interaction in general. To move a step deeper, I'm going to talk about the area that I work in most closely, which is a sub area called ubiquitous computing. And you might hear this called UbiComp for short. So ubiquitous computing involves leveraging pervasive technologies. And what I mean by that is not just desktops or laptops. I'll go into some more examples in a bit, but a smartphone will be a classic example of a pervasive technology, basically one that's all around us. And we try to leverage these technologies to create more intelligent environments. And just like in HCI in general, we're trying to solve human-centered issues. So when I'm talking about ubiquitous technologies, the first pass that most people will think about from the research side is what we would call a mobile device. So something like a smartphone, or you might see smartwatches or fitness trackers. These are devices that we could carry through us throughout the day. And yes, you could carry a laptop, but you can't use your laptop all the time, like when you're in a car, when you're on a bus, when you're on a plane, these sorts of places. Whereas my smartphone I have right next to me right now, as I'm sure many of you do as well. If you're wearing a smartwatch, then you can always have that with you as well. And this could present lots of opportunities for sensing and for interaction. And in some cases, actually, UbiComp goes before these devices. So a lot of people were doing research using feature phones that don't necessarily have sensors on them. And even Palm Pilots people have used in research in the ubiquitous computing field. But these are kind of the classic or traditional mobile devices that I've described here. There are also cutting-edge devices that we're seeing over the past couple of years that are presenting new opportunities in computer science and human-computer interaction. So for example, you might remember Google Glass from a while ago, or you might think about the more modern versions like HoloLens, for example, where we can actually see information literally in front of us while still working in the environment around us. Obviously, the Apple Vision Pro is even a more recent version that I forgot to mention of a smart glasses. There's also Bluetooth beacons that are able to wirelessly transmit information so that we know when we're in one location versus another. And some of you might be familiar with smart rings as well, which are these very small form factors. And even that small device can have a battery and multiple sensors so they can understand aspects of our health, things like sleep, breathing rate, and heart rate, of course. And I could keep on going and talk about all sorts of different devices that aren't like desktops and laptops, but are things that we can have on our body or with us at all times. Just to talk about some of the examples we have here, people are looking at new forms of clothing like smart shoes and smart fabrics that can have sensors embedded with them so that we can see people's posture, their breathing rate, and these sorts of characteristics. And going back to the brain-computer interfaces I talked about earlier, we're starting to see sensors that can go on the skin or actually inside the skin like an implantable to collect more information about our health. And I'll just throw out a couple more ubiquitous computing technologies. Hopefully I'm hitting the point home that there's lots of different technologies that can fall in this space. So you might think about smart speakers that both can convey new information by, asking, an Amazon or a Google device about a question, but we can actually use these to learn new information about, with microphones inside the home to listen to our speech or to our coughing, for example. So where my research comes in as someone who works at the intersection of human-computer interaction and in healthcare is that my research group takes advantage of many of these devices that I've already mentioned, things like smartphones, smartwatches, and smart rings in particular. And we try to take advantage of the sensors that are on these devices. For example, location data, motion data that you would get from your smartphone. At the very least, you can think about the smartphone having a motion sensor to tell whether you're holding it upright or in landscape mode. They have a microphone, which is a form of sensor. It can be able to detect sound. And then we have light sensors and camera sensors, which can provide a lot of visual information for us as well. So what we do is that we take this sensor data and then we build machine learning models, signal processing techniques, and all sorts of different algorithms to be able to extract information about people's health. And I like to classify these health indicators into 3 categories. The first is context information. So we've used sensors in the past to try to identify people's mood or to identify, whether someone's being sociable, whether they're around lots of people or if they're living by themselves. We can also use this data to understand aspects of people's behavior. So for example, we can figure out if someone's physically active by looking at how many steps they do. And we can also look at sleep data by looking at, for example, if their heart rate slows down at night. And finally, we can understand aspects of people's physiology or the medical data that a clinician would be interested in looking at. So I've already mentioned heart rate as an example. Another example related to the microphone might be cough rate, right? It could be very informative for a doctor to know how often someone coughs throughout the day. So we don't just stop there. We can get all these interesting health indicators, but ultimately what we want to be able to do is to synthesize all this data so that we can get to some high-level clinically relevant outcome for a diagnosis, for example. So again, we might be building models or presenting all this information in a compelling visualization that helps clinicians and patients understand different aspects about their health. So as some examples of some spaces I've worked in before, we've looked at respiratory diseases. This could be asthma or even COVID, for example. We can look at aging populations to make sure that our elderly relatives are staying healthy at home. And this could even involve mental well-being or mental health to understand if someone might be more depressed or if someone is experiencing a good mood. Now, one of the caveats I like to give at this part of my talk is that I'm not here to present to you all today to say that technology or AI is going to replace doctors. Quite frankly, doctors are extremely good at what they do, and I never want to imply that any technology can replace their expertise. Rather, what I hope you get out of my talk is that we're looking for opportunities for technology to help augment or to support what doctors are doing. So one way that people think about these technologies and where people sometimes get worried about digital health is they think about diagnostic screening, right? This idea that I can take a smartphone app and do some sort of test and then have it tell me that it thinks that I'm sick or that I might have a flu or a cough or, heaven forbid, cancer. And there are opportunities for these digital health technologies to help clinicians ultimately make that decision for us. However, there's also other applications where digital health could be useful. For example, if we already know that someone's sick and they've already been to the hospital, there are many remote monitoring platforms, including in Toronto, where we can send people home with devices like a Fitbit or a smartwatch that can monitor their health over time and then stream that data to the clinician so that that patient doesn't have to take up a hospital bed. We can send them home and then the doctor can look at the patient's data occasionally to know if they need to come back to the hospital to be treated. And of course, these first 2 examples I'm talking about primarily, for disease-specific kinds of conversations, but there's all sorts of topics related to health that have nothing to do with diseases, right? So for example, mental well-being isn't just a matter of being depressed or not depressed. You can have moments of low mood or high mood. You might also want to know if someone's physically active or not active, or how we can encourage people to be more active. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with the disease. Now, this research area I've talked about so far mostly has to do with sensing and using data and machine learning to be able to identify aspects of people's health. But I don't want to neglect the fact that it's important to have the human element to be able to understand, who is using this data, who's using these models to make informed decisions. And the classic example I like to give for why this is a really important thing to think about is the scale that you see on the screen here. So let's say I were to step on this weighing scale to know how much I weigh, and it said I weighed 100 kilograms on Monday. And then let's say I stepped on it on Tuesday, and it said I weighed 102 kilograms. Some people, whether they're numerically literate or just really worried, will assume that they're gaining 2 kilograms every single day. So on Wednesday, they'll be 104, and Thursday, they'll be 106, and it'll keep on going. And they'll get so worried about that they'll make these drastic changes with their lives, right? They'll start starving themselves. They'll take these pills that might try to help them lose weight. And of course, there's all sorts of weird different trends that people can infer in the other direction as well. And part of the reason for that could be that this interface that you're seeing on the screen is extremely simple. It's showing technically 2 numbers, but really just one number about a person's health. It doesn't give you any information about the fact that scales are not always accurate. There are accuracy issues with scales. The person might have decided to wear extra clothing that day. They might have drank extra water or had a big meal right before they measured themselves. There's all this other important information or data, if you will, that is not being factored into the scale. So when we're asking people to make decisions about that one simple number, it's actually more complicated than just reading a number and knowing how big that number is. Now, this is a simple kind of technology I've talked about here, but imagine that we start building these smartphone apps and other technologies that look like the ones I've shown here, where you have lots of medical numbers with jargon, or an app that is very easy to use. You just take a picture of a mark on your skin, but all of a sudden it's trying to tell people that they may have skin cancer and they need to seek a doctor. What's a person to do there? I know that I have some, elderly relatives who would be very concerned if they downloaded a technology off of the App Store and it told them that they had cancer and they didn't know what to do. Do we want to deploy these kinds of technologies to people? Should we communicate the risks of the technology, or maybe be able to frame the certainty of these algorithms? So this is another aspect that my research group looks at as well. To that point, my research group is the Computational Health and Interaction Lab. We call it CHI for short. And what we do is that we use ubiquitous and emergent technologies to address problems related to people's health and well-being. And my research group roughly works in 3 different areas. The first is that we develop what I like to call momentary health assessments, where we imagine these situations where people will pick up a device, interact with it for a couple of seconds or minutes, and then get some sort of information about their health. We also do work in continuous health sensing, where we're thinking about technologies where someone just wears a device like a smartwatch or an earbud or something like that, and it's constantly recording information about the person in order to understand an aspect of their health without having to require them to do something like, press a button or things like that. And then we also look at the design factor I mentioned earlier. How are we showing data to people, and how are we conveying information to make sure that it's satisfying the goals of both clinicians and patients? So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm briefly going to touch upon one project in each of these categories, just to give you a flavor of some of the cool technologies that we're working on in my research group. And the first project I'm going to talk about is how we're using earbuds that many of you might be wearing right now listening to this call to be able to learn information about people's cardiac function or their heart function. So for any of you who have done any fitness tracking with a device like a Fitbit or an Oura Ring, for example, this kind of screen might be familiar with you. You notice that it has information about a person's heart rate, their body temperature, and their breathing rate or their respiratory rate. And if you actually talk to a doctor, they would tell you that the reason why these numbers are on the screen is because they're considered vital signs, some of the information that almost every doctor wants to know about a patient who walks in the door. But if you notice here, there are 4 major vital signs I've shown on the screen. And it turns out that most devices that are currently used in commodity scenarios will only do temperature, heart rate, and respiratory rate. Blood pressure is one of these really important measurements that a lot of doctors care about, but we don't get from a Fitbit or an Oura ring. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we can actually collect blood pressure data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with different ways we can get blood pressure. And the way I like to talk about these technologies is to think about how accurate they are, as well as how scalable they are. In other words, how easy is it for the average person to get these kinds of measurements? So on the far end of the spectrum, the idea of something that's not very scalable, but that's very accurate, we have devices like these clinical grade blood pressure cuffs, or even in surgeries, people insert stents or needles basically into people's arms to measure their blood pressure. And as you can imagine, this is not something you can do at home, the idea of sticking something in someone's arm, and it could also be very expensive. Another issue with these kinds of measurements is this phenomenon called the white coat effect. This idea that when I go to my doctor, I might be a little nervous or I might be in some sort of weird situation because I'm not used to the place I'm going to. And it's very common that when people visit their doctor, they can actually have an elevated blood pressure because of that kind of nervousness. If we're thinking about technologies that can actually be used in home, there are blood pressure cuffs that you could buy at home, and then you can also find blood pressure cuffs that you can wrap around your wrist. And this is a little bit better because you can use it at home. You don't have to worry about going to the doctor. It's still a little bit expensive. It's not the kind of device that you can use all the time. You have to put on the device, sit still for a second, and then get a measurement. And there's also the risk that people might use it incorrectly when they're not there with their doctor. It turns out if you read the instruction manual for these kinds of devices, you're supposed to sit very still. You have to place the device in a very specific part of your arm. You can't just slap it on your arm and hope that you get the right number. There are some steps you need to do. More recently, there have been attempts in my area of research of ubiquitous computing to use technologies like a smartwatch, for example, to be able to measure blood pressure. But what we find is that these techniques mainly use light-based measurements, as I'll talk about a little later, which means that they're very challenging to generalize across individuals. You can imagine that if you're using something that involves shining a light into a person's skin, then the color of that person's skin would impact the quality of the data that you get. So to that point, I'm going to briefly introduce some cool terminology for you all to think about from the clinical domain. A lot of technologies like a smartwatch, like a Fitbit, for instance, rely on a technique called photoplethysmography, or PPG for short, in order to measure things like heart rate and to some extent blood pressure. The basic idea of this technique is that you shine a light into a part of the body, like someone's wrist or the finger, and then you measure how much light gets reflected back onto a light sensor. And the idea of this technology is that if there's a lot of blood in the fingertip, you will get a different amount of light that gets reflected back versus when there's not a lot of light in the fingertip. So this is a non-invasive way of measuring how much blood is flowing through a particular part of the body. And you can use this information to figure out aspects like heart rate variability, and to some extent blood pressure, although there's a lot of questions about how accurate blood pressure can be done using this method. But if you think about going to the doctor and how your doctor measures, aspects of your heart, they don't shine a light at your body and measure your heart rate. They listen to your heart by using a stethoscope, for example. They're listening for the heart sounds. And it turns out that the sound of your heart has a lot of very interesting information that doctors care about. For example, they can actually hear when the valve of the heart is opening and closing, which could tell a lot of information about if you have a murmur or an arrhythmia where there might be a misbeat. But as you can imagine, using a stethoscope is not easy. I know when I was a kid, I would pretend I would hold a stethoscope up to my parents' chest and pretend I'm listening to their heart sound. But if you actually try to do it, you need to have pretty good placement in order to know exactly where to put that diaphragm in order to measure the heart sound. Now, the thing that is really cool about these heart sounds that I've just mentioned is that you don't just actually hear them at the heart. You can actually hear them throughout your body. And it just so happens that because there are blood vessels that go near the ear, you can actually pick up on these heart sounds near the ear canal. Now, that sounds like it may be a little wild, but what I'd like for you to think about is imagine I asked everyone to stand up and do, 50 jumping jacks or to run around a whole bunch. If you're to sit still after that, you might remember, last time you worked out, having your head pumping or almost feeling like you could hear your heartbeat. And that's the signal that basically we can actually listen to even when someone's not exercising. It's just that when you exercise, that sound becomes more obvious to us. And our research, among other researchers who are working internationally, we're taking advantage of the fact that we can actually use the sensors embedded in some noise canceling earbuds to be able to detect this signal. The basic principle of how we do this using an earbud, and specifically, as I mentioned here, is a noise canceling earbud, is we're taking advantage of two sensors that are in the device. So the typical earbud that you have for doing noise cancellation, what it's doing is that it's listening for the ambient sound. And when I say ambient, I mean the sound that's like in the environment around us. And to do the noise cancellation, this earbud is listening for this ambient noise. And it's also listening inside the ear to make sure it knows what that sound sounds like inside our ear, as well as, of course, if we're playing any music inside our ear. And then what the earbud does is that it plays basically anti-noise or some sort of signal back using the speaker to cancel out that ambient noise so that we only hear what we're interested in. And in order to make this possible, there's actually two microphones inside these earbuds. There's one microphone that's outside of the earbud that listens for this ambient sound. And then there's a microphone that's placed inside the ear that is able to listen to exactly what the sound is inside our ear canal. And what research has shown, or our work included, is that you can actually listen to the audio from this in-ear microphone to be able to hear heart sounds, breathing sounds, and all sorts of other interesting body sounds related to health. So our work is using this earbud to make, excuse me, to make the sound from an earbud sound similar to what we would detect from a stethoscope, that signal that the doctor would be using in their clinic. So what I'm showing here is I'm showing different representations of what the heart sounds might look like. We don't need to actually worry about specifically what the lines are, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play some sounds to give you an example of what these different sounds sound like, essentially. So first I'm going to play this top row, which shows what the sound is like coming from a stethoscope. Hopefully you get the idea. It sounds like a heartbeat. Hopefully many of you are familiar with that sound already. Now this next clip I'm going to play for you is going to come from the microphone inside an earbud without any processing whatsoever. So this is just if you were to get a wire and listen directly to that microphone there. So it probably sounded very messy. You might have heard a heartbeat sound, maybe you didn't, but it's not a very good quality. That's because that signal we're listening for is very subtle, right? It's not an obvious thing that you can hear unless you were to exercise, as I mentioned earlier. However, what my research group has been able to do is that we're using deep learning or machine learning to be able to take that second sound you heard and then process it so that it sounds more like something you get out of a digital stethoscope without, just completely making up what the data sounds like. It's really trying to convey exactly when the heartbeat sounds are and how the heart is supposed to sound, but it's getting rid of all that other noise that we don't care about. So one thing I maybe didn't make entirely clear is that those two clips I played before are the exact same person and the exact same heart. And what I'm going to play now is yet again another clip from the exact same person and the exact same heart, but after that audio went through our algorithm. And hopefully you can hear there that this clip sounds much more like what we would get from a digital stethoscope. We have a very clean heart signal that a doctor could analyze to either measure heart rate variability, or understand other aspects about our health. So that's an example of how we're using a technology for a momentary health assessment. I'm now going to switch gears and talk about how we're doing using technology for continuous health sensing. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how we've done speech analysis to be able to understand respiratory monitoring, or how well a person's lungs are functioning. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term COPD, COPD is short for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. And this is a very prevalent lung disease, essentially, that affects millions of people worldwide. It accounts for 14% of annual deaths, at least as of 2023. It's probably continuing to be there in 2024. And as I mentioned, there's over 200 million, actually, even more than I said before, 200 million people living with COPD. So it's a very common disease, and it's the culprit for many deaths worldwide. And something to think about with COPD is this isn't just the kind of disease that happens once and then the person's healthy and they don't have to worry about it ever again. Once someone's been diagnosed with COPD, it's a chronic condition, which means that they always need to be monitoring their health and to be prepared for a potential exacerbation. The term exacerbation basically refers to an episode where someone's symptoms become so severe so quickly that they're required to go to a hospital to get immediate medical treatment. So there's lots of different ways that we can measure a person's lung function or respiratory function to maybe be able to predict when someone might have an exacerbation. One technology we can use is by using something called a spirometer, which is a clinical device where someone breathes into the device as quickly as they can and as hard as they can in order to measure both how much air comes out of their lungs and how quickly they can push it out of their lungs. And some would consider this to be a very quantitative or reliable way of measuring lung function. But these devices, like I mentioned with the blood pressure cuffs earlier, are not necessarily cheap. They can be relatively expensive. And more importantly, they actually require training to use. It's not just that you can breathe into this device. You have to breathe in a very particular way. So doctors really have to encourage people to breathe very hard in order to get an accurate measurement. Now, there's lots of researchers worldwide who are actually looking at how we can use things like speech recordings and recordings of people's coughs to be able to infer information about their lung function. So the idea is basically I would take my phone, for example, hit record, start talking, or saying a specific phrase, and then we can use machine learning algorithms to be able to analyze, basically the qualities like the pitch and my speaking rate from that audio to be able to understand whether my lungs are functioning properly or not. Now, this is a much easier test to do. I can get my phone and record myself any second, and I don't need any training to do it. A spirometer requires a lot of work for me to use. However, because this is an active assessment, or it's something that I have to turn on and off, it can only be used a few times a day. And because I know exactly when it's happening, I might actually change my voice, unintentionally or not. For example, right now, as I'm presenting to you, I'm trying to talk a little bit slower than I normally do. Maybe you think it's fast, but this is slow for me. And I'm also trying to speak more clearly than I usually do. Whereas if I was talking with my friends or talking on the bus on the phone, I would be talking completely differently. And this might actually change how I analyze the data or the reliability of the data I analyze. So moving down the screen, there is this opportunity for doing what we call passive assessment, where the person they know that they're being recorded, but they don't necessarily need to turn on and off exactly when the recording is happening. An example of this might be using something like an Amazon Echo, for example, or Alexa, where it's actually continuously listening to audio and then constantly analyzing that speech to be able to identify whether I'm saying, "Hey, Alexa," or coughing, for example. So many people, for instance, have developed technologies that are able to record how many times someone coughs per day. And you might say, well, can't someone just count how many times they cough per day? And you can do that. But a lot of people forget. A lot of people actually underestimate how often they cough. And in fact, it's not just about how often someone coughs, but there's actually different kinds of cough sounds. Some coughs are completely healthy and normal, while other coughs might actually be indicative of some serious health issues. So some advantages of passive sensing is that it can happen throughout the day, and it helps us observe natural lung function rather than, kind of these contrived scenarios where I'm trying to talk very clearly or cough very clearly. But some of the challenges, privacy being one that I'll talk about later, is that these technologies are typically used indoors, and they've only really been used for cough analysis or wheezing analysis. So what I'm going to talk about for one of our projects called Poma Listener is that we've actually built a passive sensing technology that's able to analyze aspects of a person's speech throughout the day, not just when someone's recording. And we do this with the intent of trying to detect worsening lung function. So imagine for a minute that you were wearing a smartwatch throughout the day and it was recording all of the audio. And I'm sure there's all sorts of concerns happening right now about privacy. I'll get there one slide, so give me a moment with that. But imagine that we had these continuous audio recordings, and we wanted to be able to identify specific clips, basically, of a person's speech. Well, the first problem I'd have to deal with is the fact that there's a lot of other sounds that are happening around me throughout the day. There's dogs barking, there's cars that are honking, there's construction happening, maybe there's a microwave going on in the background. So we need to be able to separate speech from non-speech in our audio. And to do that, we use a machine learning model that's built for what we call voice activity detection. Basically, this is a deep machine learning model that's able to tell, is this speech or is this not speech? But that's not enough, because I talk with other people throughout the day. And, my friends don't necessarily want to have their speech analyzed to figure out if they have a lung impairment, nor do I want the doctor to think I'm healthy because a technology is listening to someone else speak. So from here, we need to identify if it's the patient's voice that we're listening for in particular. And what we do is that we use a second technology called a speaker verification model that's able to separate whether the speech is coming from me or from someone else. You might have encountered this before if you've ever used any sort of voice recognition technology for something like a Google device or an Amazon device, where it's able to tell the difference between your voice from someone else's voice. And now that we've gotten to this point, we've ideally identified segments of audio that correspond to the patient's own speech. We're not done yet, because I said the entire point of this technology was to estimate something about a person's lung function. So again, we have a final model that analyzes the characteristics of this audio, things like, their pitch, how quickly they're speaking, and all sorts of other characteristics. And then we use that to be able to say whether someone has very severe symptoms of COPD, so things like coughing and wheezing, or if someone has perfectly fine lung function. Now, I said privacy is very important, so I want to make sure I talk about that very explicitly, because I'm talking about technology that in theory could be listening to the speech or the audio around us throughout the day. So all sorts of people would be recorded without consent. The first thing I want to say is that all the research that we've done here at the University of Toronto has been done in consultation with our ethics board. So we've worked with our ethics board to be able to figure out ways to make sure we can carry out this research in a very sound way. But technologically, there's also opportunities to think about how can we do this analysis in a way that preserves people's privacy. So without going into too many of the technical details, because I have lots of terms on the screen that I'm not really going to talk about, what I'll say is that we've been able to show that we don't need that much audio to be able to do this analysis. In fact, all we really need is a 2-second chunk of audio taken basically at every hour, stitch them together, and then be able to do our measurement. So if you imagine, if I were to record a random 2 seconds of you talking between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and 3 and 4, and then stitch them all together. And in fact, there's other things we do to manipulate the data so we don't hear exactly what the person's saying. But even if you did know exactly what a person was saying for 2 seconds, there isn't a lot that someone can say that would breach their privacy in 2 seconds. So there's multiple things we do to preserve privacy. I mentioned that we manipulate the data in some ways, but the key takeaway from this slide I want to get is that we can look at a very short amount of audio and still be able to do this kind of analysis. So for those of you who might be clinically inclined, or maybe are familiar with some accuracy measurements that are used in medicine, I did want to talk about the accuracy of the system a little bit and some of the cool considerations that we look at. So what this graph is showing here on the horizontal or the x-axis is how many days of data we need in order to understand a person's unique voice characteristics. Because you can imagine that, men sound differently from women, young people sound differently from older people. So we need to have some sort of understanding of what a person's voice sounds like in order to build these models. But what we were able to show is that without any of this training data or initial data for calibration, we're able to get okay results. We are able to get an F1 score is basically a measure of accuracy. We get something on the order of 55% accuracy, which isn't great, but it's okay. If we have 9 days of training data from someone, which basically means that we've learned their voice characteristics for 9 days, we can significantly increase the accuracy of that model to something like 70%. Again, 70% is not something that I would ever say will replace a doctor and be able to do diagnosis on its own. But that's, again, why I stress this idea that these technologies could be used in consultation with a doctor to maybe flag moments when someone might need extra attention for their health. Another thing, a result I'll talk about that's very interesting is rather than thinking about how much data we need to train the model, we can also look at how far ahead in advance can the model actually predict something about a person's health. And what we found from doing this experiment is that if you give data from, let's say Monday, and then you ask the model to predict what my lung function is going to look like 4 days after, we found that the model was still able to have the same accuracy. So not only can we detect from someone's speech if they're sick at that exact time, at that day, but we actually found that we could pick up on aspects of people's speech that could predict in the future whether they might experience an exacerbation, which is really exciting for us. So I have 10 minutes left, and I might go through this a little quickly to make sure we have time for questions. But I briefly want to talk about some of the research we're doing in the menstrual health space, and particularly about how we're thinking about interactive design for these technologies. So menstrual health is I didn't really call it out as a vital sign because it's not a clinically classic vital sign, but it's a very important aspect of people's health that affects nearly half of the world's population. It's anyone with a uterus, not just a woman. It could be anyone who's female identifying, roughly between the ages of 10 to 55, will relate to some aspect of menstrual health. And if you actually look at the App Store, you would find hundreds of menstrual tracking apps where people want to know exactly when they're going to experience menstrual bleeding. And they were downloaded over 200 million times in 2019. I'm sure that number is higher in 2024. But these technologies are not perfect, these menstrual health tracking apps. One of the challenges of why these menstrual tracking apps aren't really solving people's problems is that there's so much more to menstrual tracking than just about knowing when someone's about to experience their period. So yes, there are people who are using these technologies to know when is my next period going to be, so I know when I need to, maybe schedule a different event or make sure that I have, extra medication or snacks or something like that. But there's other reasons why people want to track their menstrual health. For example, knowing when they can anticipate mood swings, which may or may not be during their menstruation. They might also want to know if their menstrual cycle is normal. And I put normal in big quotes because there's a lot of clinical literature that talks about how there's no such thing as a consistent 30-day menstrual cycle. There's a lot of differences across individuals. And even within the same individual, the definition of what might be normal or consistent can actually change over time. And of course, there's also this education aspect. People want to know what's happening with their bodies in general. And part of the reason for why this is so challenging is that menstrual health isn't just about menstruation, that bleeding part. There's an entire phase, a cycle that happens where biologically women and people who menstruate are constantly having their bodies change because of hormones and other factors in their body. And it's not just that period of bleeding that's important, it's these other hormone fluctuations that can affect all different aspects of health and vice versa. Other aspects of health can affect these hormone regulations. As I mentioned earlier, another challenge with these technologies is that there's no such thing as a typical menstrual cycle. If you were to turn to a study that was done in, I think it was 2004, as I say on the slide here, where these researchers polled 100 people and asked them, about aspects of their menstrual cycle. What they found is that while the average menstrual cycle was roughly on a monthly basis, as maybe people would expect anecdotally, there was a wide range across all participants. So there are some people who had menstrual cycles as short as 21 days, and some people had cycles as long as 35 days. And in fact, there were almost 50% of the people who were polled had a range of menstrual cycles that were longer than 7 days. So what I mean by that is that some people had a menstrual cycle 1 month that was only 21 days, and then they had a second one that was 30 days. Very wide range within the same individual. And finally, and most importantly from my research perspective, self-reported data is not enough. So these technologies, these menstrual tracking apps, rely on very simple information that people will type on their phone. So for example, you'll press a button to say, I am menstruating, or this is how much I was bleeding, and yes, I'm experiencing a mood swing. And that's it. There are some recent technologies that are starting to look at information like temperature, and I'll talk about our efforts to do that as well. But most of the apps that you'll find on the app stores currently only rely on this very basic information. And how this information translates to menstrual health prediction really depends on person to person. And even again, within the same person, it will change over time. So one of our research directions is looking at how we can build an accurate and insightful menstrual health tracker that helps people who menstruate understand more about their bodies. So what we've done, we conducted a study, I believe it was back in 2021. It was fairly early after I moved here, where we collected all different sorts of data, sources of data from people who menstruate. So we conducted a 3-month study where we asked people to do this self-reporting, this recording of basically a diary of their menstrual health, as I mentioned earlier. We also had people record on a daily basis their hormone levels using a device called the Mirror Hormone Analyzer. So in short, this is a technology that relies on analyzing urine to be able to understand your hormone levels. And you can actually buy this and use this in your own home. This is not something you need to go to a doctor to use. We also looked at a technology called a CGM, or a continuous glucose monitor. So this allows people to measure their blood glucose measurements or their blood sugar levels throughout the day, and not just using a single finger prick. This is a device that you almost staple onto your arm so that you can measure your blood sugar throughout the day. And these are primarily used by people who have diabetes, but there are other reasons why people might use these devices. And finally, we asked our participants to use a Fitbit to record their heart rate, sleep data, and temperature data. So I mentioned earlier that there are some recent technologies like the Oura Ring device and Fitbit, for example, that are trying to use skin temperature data to be able to predict someone's menstrual cycle. And in fact, we in our data analysis have kind of been able to confirm this correlation between temperature data and hormone data. I'm not going to go into detail about what this graph is showing, but the basic idea is that you see those red and yellow peaks. These correspond to peaks in hormones. And then the blue corresponds to peaks in the wrist skin temperature data. And this horizontal axis that you're seeing here is showing progress through the menstrual cycle. And the point I want to convey here is that when we normalize everyone and account for the fact that people have different menstrual cycles, the peak in the hormone data happens first, and then sometime after, there's a peak in the temperature data. And that relationship is generally true for a lot of people. And that's what the underlying principle of a lot of the technologies that are trying to do menstrual tracking using sensor data. However, our research has shown that it's not that simple, that while that trend does hold, there's a wide variability across individuals. So what might be a difference in 3 days for one person might be a difference in 5 days between those peaks for another. Conversely, what we've actually been able to show is that by looking at glucose data, there's actually deviations in glucose data that change according to the menstrual cycle. Again, I'm not going to go into this graph in too much detail, but you notice how this graph is going down and then up, and there's basically this cyclical pattern that you can imagine repeating from month to month. And what we've done here is that we've taken the glucose data, we've accounted for all sorts of other factors like what a person was eating, how much exercise they got. And when we remove all those factors away and we look strictly at the people's blood sugar level, we're able to identify this pattern that happens from across a person's menstrual cycle that remains relatively consistent. So on the one hand, this gives us some insight into the fact that maybe if someone who's diabetic is using blood sugar data to identify if they need to take insulin or something like that, we actually need to take into account the fact that menstruation can actually affect that glucose data. At the same time, this also shows that there might be a promise in being able to use this glucose data to actually predict aspects of the menstrual cycle. And we're really excited about both of these opportunities. So that is a whirlwind tour of some of the research that we've done in my research lab. I'm leaving this on here so you can see all sorts of other projects we've done. You'll notice that there's I gotta move my icon here. Yes, there is a QR code in the top right. So you can go to our lab's website and see more information by looking at all my students' web pages or some of the information we have on my lab's web page. And I've also provided my contact information over here as well. On the left side is my contact information and my website. And on the right side is the contact information for my research group, as well as social media as well. So with that, I'll conclude and say thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Alex. That was really eye-opening and very informative. We have a couple of questions there. The first one was really about disabled people. Can you tell us about the current state of technology, how that works? Disabled people using tools that basically commanded by the brain waves.
Sure. Yeah. So there's all sorts of different ways that interactive technologies have been used for people with motor impairments or accessibility needs. So brain-computer interaction is a very good example because it doesn't require any any motor function really. At its core, we all need a function with our brains in order to be able to do anything, breathe, eat, all these sorts of things. So we can rely on that signal and the fact that people can think without having any sort of other abilities and be able to analyze that data in order to be able to infer intention or people's thoughts. Another example of a technology that's very often used for these kinds of individuals is gaze interaction. So before, I've seen some people, like Stephen Hawking has kind of the latest and greatest technology when it comes to interacting with computers with brainwaves. I believe, hopefully I'm not making this up, at a time he used a technology that was gaze-based, but I know there are definitely people who have used gaze technologies where if someone is, say, restricted in a wheelchair, and maybe they aren't able to move their arms and legs, but they're still able to move their eyes, what we can do is we can present information on a screen and follow where their eyes are looking using a gaze tracker, essentially, to know exactly, what letter their eyes are hovering over or what words they're looking at, and be able to use these to basically give another form of input that someone can interact with the technology. And again, both of these technologies and many others that I've talked about, basically at the core are recording sensor data that needs to be analyzed either using machine learning or signal processing to be able to either classify from pick from a specific categories of command or actions to identify someone's intention. Or you can think about it for the gaze tracking, for example, if I can classify your attention to like one of 26 categories, there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. I could form any word I want with that alphabet, and then I could form sentences. And people have done the same thing with brainwaves as well, being able to classify different letters. So there's a lot of different opportunities and many more than the ones I've described, but brain-computer interaction and gaze tracking are two of the more popular ones I've seen for people with motor disabilities.
So for those people who, let's say, have their arms amputated and you have artificial limb there, are they able to basically using brain pulse to move their artificial hands and everything?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that's using, rather than trying to think about just words, going directly to basically, you can think about sending brave signals over to these artificial limbs. And these artificial limbs are doing this kind of, classification, signal processing, and recognition to be able to basically give commands for what that artificial limb should do, right? Should I move this pinky? Should I move it in? Should I move it out? At what angle should I do it? It's very similar to how people think about robotics. It's constantly analyzing sensor data that's being recorded from the environment, or in this case, from the person's brain, and then transducing that signal to be able to know how it should control a piece of machinery.
How practical are they now in actual practice?
Popular. Well, so cost is definitely a big concern with artificial limbs. It's a constant race with technology, right? There's hardware is always becoming cheaper, but it's always becoming more advanced, and those are competing factors. So, the average ordinary person, without, very good health coverage, it might be hard for them to get an artificial limb, but I think it's definitely in the category of emerging technologies where it's going to become much more prevalent, where you see things like artificial limbs. What are some other examples? We see like heart pumps, which also operate on similar principle, not quite brain waves, but they're analyzing data in real time about our hearts and using that to inform how the mechanics inside a device go to control our bodies.
So what you're saying is not a matter of technology, but it's a matter of cost.
I think there is some technological difficulty, but I mean, I'm sure all of us have seen videos before online where someone's using an artificial limb for the first time and they're grabbing a can and things like that. So there's definitely technological advancements that can be made. There's also, how do you get someone accustomed to using these devices? Or is there calibration that needs to happen to account for the unique patterns in someone's brain waves? Because that's an important characteristic that we have to look for in these technologies. But then I think there's also these cost issues, obviously, of, I can't just go to Target or Walmart and buy an artificial limb. I need to get something that's very custom fit to myself. It needs to have the right form factor. It needs to know my specific brain characteristics. And these can obviously increase the costs as well.
Is there anything now that you can read people's mind? The reverse technology.
There is, my quick answer is no. I think it's going to be really hard to say that technology can straight up read people's minds. But, going back to like the example, like brain computer interaction or some other technologies I'll talk about in a second, these devices are usually programmed to say, rather than try to read your mind, it's saying, read your mind, assuming that you're thinking about one of the following 10 things. And actually a lot of machine learning, especially if you think before large language models and generative models, a lot of the original machine learning models are basically trained to say, which one of the following 5 objects is this? Is this a cat, a dog, and that's it? Similarly, with these kinds of, brain-computer interaction devices, it's not necessarily saying, read my mind and tell the robotic arm what to do. What it's doing is it's saying, read the signals and then tell me whether I should move this finger or that finger, or how much I should move this finger. Another technology I've seen that's not quite in the accessibility range is that there's a device called the Emotiv, EMOTIV. And what that was designed to do is that it's designed to try to read people's emotions, to say if someone's happy, sad, stressed, or not stressed. But again, it's not really reading people's minds. It's reading people's physiological data, like their brain function and stuff like that. And it's trying to understand, which category are you closest to according to those categories. So we could definitely learn a lot about people's health and information based on these signals. But to say it's reading people's minds and it's, it has infinite possibilities and it's able to tell from these infinite possibilities, that's a bit tougher.
All right. We have another question with too technical. I encourage the person to contact the professor directly. So let me see this other one. It's possible to analyze the result from the data retrieved from the electrical device, but how to get the baseline, the true fact about people's health? How could you determine it's true or not?
Okay. So I don't quite understand the question, but I think there's a couple different ways I can understand the question. So let me address both of them. So let me take the speech example, because that's an example where, as I mentioned earlier, everyone has their own speech characteristics. The way I sound is very different from Andy, from T, every individual has their own unique voice. And we don't want to ever develop a system where it's going to be biased because of gender, because of age, or these factors, right? We don't want to give women different diagnoses from men just because of how they sound. We want to make sure technologies take into account all these, unique facets of individuals. So there are definitely ways we could train machine learning models where we try to get so much data from so many diverse people that it just works. We basically don't have to calibrate for an individual person, but we calibrate because we have data from other people who are similar to me, for example. But what we showed in our system that I talked about earlier, the POMA listener one for COPD, is that what we ended up doing was actually building up a speech profile for each individual person so that we can understand basically what is healthy and what's not healthy for that person. And you can imagine that there might be challenges of like, well, how am I supposed to use a system if I need to calibrate it for, multiple days? But there's this tension again between like, can you deploy a system without calibration, or do you need this calibration first? So very often when I'm talking about these technologies that are very much still building up and emerging, sometimes what we think about is that we first deploy them thinking about calibration, saying that we don't have much data because this is new data we're collecting for the first time. So we'll do some sort of calibration to the person's unique characteristics. And by doing that, over time, we're going to build up a massive database with a lot of rich information where we know people who got sick, people who stayed healthy, people who are young, people who are old. And over time, we can build basically a database and a better model that's able to generalize to new people without having to have that training data. So that's one way of how we address this. There's lots of different other ones where we can use signal processing to do calibration. I'm going to leave my answer there, but if you have further questions, I'm happy to answer them over email.
Great. With that, well, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us this fascinating area of research and actually practicality. Look forward to see more of your products there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know you have some other thing you have to take care of tonight.
Yes.
Really appreciate coming here to share with us.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.